بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Now, as promised, the second lecture in the course is about the history of children's literature. To know where you stand and to know the next steps that you're going to take, you have to have an idea about your own history. All people do that. All branches of knowledge start from this standpoint, looking at history and moving from history from the past to the future. And since this is a rather relatively, as I said, comparatively new genre, it is our job to look at how it began. Just like Animal Farm, when we studied it, we studied before it the wolf and the lamb. We talked about fable, we talked about allegory, we talked about the relationship between the novel and Russian history. So you can never overlook or do without history if you deal with literature. Literature and history are one and the same thing. They are not separate. They are not divorced from each other. This is a nice journey into the history of children's literature. Before you see the slides, ask yourself this very simple question. When and how did children's literature start? Okay? When and how? When in history? And what happened when it began? Okay? The answer to this question forms the body of this second lecture, inshallah. In the coming lectures, we'll talk about the characteristics of children's literature. And when we finish the characteristics, we finish the theoretical part of the course. The last part, which is very important, will testify to the knowledge we are having now. It will be a practical application of what we are having now in theory. So, history. Some general remarks. Children's literature first clearly, that is to say, specifically, okay, emerged, appeared as a distinct and independent form of literature in the second half of the 18th century. Which means that before the second half of the 18th century, there was children's literature, but it was not specific, it was not clear, it was not distinct. It became distinct, it became obvious, it became clear, it became independent in the second half of the 18th century, before which it had been, at best, only in an embryonic stage, in a primitive stage, in a vague stage, in a stage that is not limited or specific or clear. So once again, when did it begin as a clear branch of knowledge, genre of literature in the second half of the 18th century? Did the children's literature as a form exist before the 18th century? Yes, it existed, but just like the novel. When you studied the rise of the novel arose in the 18th century, but before the rise of the novel, there were some examples of the novel in earlier versions of it, right? Like anecdotes, like stories, like folk tales, ballads. Go back to the other course, you will see. From when to when, the second half of the 18th century, from when to when, from the year 1750 until the year 1799. This is the second half of the 18th century. Children's literature has its roots in the stories and songs that adults told their children before publishing existed. Now we are talking about the period of time before the second half of the 18th century, in order to prove that there were some examples of children's literature before. Like what? Songs, stories told orally, by the tongue, orally. People told stories and songs to their children, like the mother in every culture, every time that is angry or sad or fretting because her child does not want to sleep. So she keeps singing to him or telling him bedtime stories so that he or she will go to sleep. Those kinds of stories or songs are called children's literature, but in a general sense, of course. They are not a body of knowledge, they are not science, they are not a genre. Because of this, it can be difficult to track the development of early stories, even since widespread printing. When printing came later in the Renaissance, things became better. Many classical tales were originally created for adults and have been adapted for a younger audience. When the printing was invented, writers began to translate from other cultures and to write stories for adults, and those stories for adults were simplified and told to the younger generation, that is to say, to children. Although originally children's literature was often a rewriting of other forms, like poetry, like the novel, and like drama. You take those great stories, and we'll have an example from this, and simplify them or abridge them and sum them up. But since the 1400s, there has been much literature aimed specifically at children. We can sum up what we have said, okay? There was some kind of oral tradition of children's literature before the invention of the press. The press, that is, the printing machine. When the printing machine was invented, books for adults were summed up for children. And then in the 1400s, some books for children began to be written. There has been much literature aimed specifically at children. Before that, no books were specifically written for children. Often, what happened at that time, what was the goal of those books, moral or religious? The goal was religious, the goal was moral, to preach, to teach children a moral lesson. To some extent, the nature of children's fiction and the divide between all the children's and adult fiction became blurred as time went by, and tales appealing to both adult and child had substantial commercial success. That is to say, those books written for children were read by adults, and those books written for adults were read by children, and there is no divide between both. But we, for the sake of convenience, we study children's literature. In the beginning, the same tales that adults tell and enjoy are adapted for children. Then stories are created specifically for children to educate, instruct, and entertain them. And then it was established as a separate form. The development of children's literature is influenced by the social, educational, political, and economic resources of the country or ethnic group. If you take the blacks in America, for example, or the Christians in Egypt, or the Jews in Britain, or any ethnic minority anywhere all over the whole world, and look into the tradition of children's literature in those groups, you will find lots of surprises, lots of differences, and lots of things that tell us how children's literature has developed. It develops according to these factors: the social conditions of those people, the educational circumstances, the political scene, the economic scene. All such matters interfere together or cooperate together to give us what is called children's literature. This is a book called Aspects and Issues in the History of Children's Literature from the International Research Society for Children's Literature. There is a point of view here. What does it say? The development of literature for children anywhere in the world follows the same basic path. All children's literature, whatever its current stage of development, begins with spoken stories, songs, and poems. Like the novel, like poetry, like drama. Before poetry and drama and the novel, there were oral things, oral productions, like spoken stories, songs, and poems. like Juha, for example, or like Anta in our literature. Those are stories that are told for us by previous generations, by grandparents and parents, and we as parents tell them to our children convey them to their children, and so on. That is the beginning. And then there comes a time when all such things are put together, combined together, and written down for study or for reading. Up until the 19th century, books written for children were entirely religious and instructional, or for the improvement of their moral manners. We could say moral. For the improvement of the moral standards of children. Until the 19th century, everything written for children had a moral purpose. Okay? Later on, we will discover what happened to children's literature. What do you know about how children were viewed prior to the inception of child development as a discipline? The views about children then influenced nature of literature. In the year 1865, a very famous book in the field of children's literature called Alice in the Wonderland. Alice in the Wonderland was written and published at that time. Alice in the Wonderland. It was written, the first book that was written for mere enjoyment. That's my point. We say that until the 19th century in England, let's say in England, children's literature had one purpose. That was moral. Starting from the end of the 19th century, children's literature began to be written for enjoyment, not just for fun, not just for a moral purpose. Do you understand? And that marked the beginning of children's literature. Here, at that point of time, we could say that this is real children's literature. 1850, 1865, it doesn't matter. In the second half, as we said, from 1850 until 1899, that was the time in which children's literature grew and flourished and prospered as a genre. When did it specifically turn into a separate, independent, individual discipline? In the second half of the 19th century, when literature for children began to seek fun and pleasure and enjoyment. That is to say, when writers began to understand really what the child needs. What does the child need? To all the time moralize him or preach to him or give him moral lessons, do this and don't do that. This is halal, this is haram. If you say that all the time, the child will lose interest. The child will naturally get bored if you keep preaching for him in this way. So Alice in the Wonderland, 1865. More experimentations with genres, from teaching values to fantasy fiction, blurring age boundaries. I mean, these are the differences between children's literature now and children's literature in the past. There is more experimentation. You have lots of forms like fantasy fiction teaching values, blurring age boundaries. They do not limit themselves to age 18. They talk about younger generations of people like Harry Potter, for example, changing topics, like talking about technology, talking about terrorism, differing technology and commercialization, books on audio and videotapes like Harry Potter. Now, the examples of children's literature available in the market are not limited to books or book formats. You have them on CDs, you have them in DVDs, you have them as audio, you have them as video. Increasing diversity, melting pot versus salad bowl, international literature, building on the past, looking into the future. These are the changes. Now let us have a journey, a nice journey now. It's a new form. Before 1850, books taught lessons on manners and morals. I have already said that you find before 1850. morals and manners. Look at the child here having a big book talking to him from the Bible, for example. Halal, haram, taboo, allowed, prohibited, not prohibited. Reading like this and memorizing and then being afraid of taboos. No, teach him the same but in an enjoyable manner. He or she will understand you and will appreciate what you say and benefit by that. Books also contained lessons on the ideas of history and science that existed at that time. Any book for children at that time used to talk about science, technology, civilization, and so on. And that was boring. Hard facts are hard for children. They don't like that. And this is the result. Children found the books, the moralizing books, the books before 1850, until Alice in the Wonderland came, which came for pleasure. Before that, the books on morality and the books on science and the books on history and civilization, all those books written for children before 1850 were what? Dull. So, they were dull, they were boring, uninteresting. What is the result? They read stories intended for adults. If they don't find the pleasure they need as children, they look for it. And they found that pleasure and enjoyment and fun in the books like these that were written for adults. Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving, the American writer. Okay, so they leave this and they begin to look for adventure. They soar, they fly. Let us go a little bit earlier now to the beginnings. In 1600, Prophet Muhammad was born in the year 571. 1600, the Old English period, at the beginning of the history of England. Monks and these are monks, people in the church, clerics, priests, and other learned men wrote lesson books for children. A man like this or a man like this writing a book for children, that would be dull, dry, stiff, uninteresting. Children's literature dates back to, it goes back to, in the previous slide we said 1600. So does it go back to the year 1850 or 1865? Some of you will ask me, are dates important? Yes. Not all of them, of course. The most important ones, like this. You have to know, when did children's literature begin to be written? It was written from the year 1600. But when was the real beginning of children's literature? 1865. It dates back to the year 1600, of course. First choice. Why did children prefer reading Gulliver's Travels, written for adults, and Robinson Crusoe to reading books by scholars and preachers? Why is that? The latter books, the last ones, reading books by scholars. The books written later here means the books written by scholars and preachers. These were dull. That was the reason. The former, Gulliver's Travels and Robinson Crusoe, were available? No. Both novels were a must at schools? No. So the first answer is correct. There is someone called John Newbery, who was a writer, a publisher, and a bookseller in the church. He published a series of books for children, recognized they had special interest, and tried to meet them. An early beginning, he recognized that children had special interest, and he tried to meet children. He printed chap books. What is chap books? Cheap little paper editions which were sold on the streets by chapmen. What are chapmen? Chapmen, peddlers, the people selling things on the street and calling, I have mangoes, I have apples or oranges or whatever. Those are called chapmen. Chapmen got the books written by John Newbery, and they sold them for children. They contained ballads and folk tales. The ordinary person could afford to buy these books. They were cheap. They were called chapbooks. So what are chapbooks? Chapbooks are cheap little paper editions written by Newbery and sold by Chapman. He also published translations from French, as I told you. After the invention of the press, there were some translations. Tales of Mother Goose by Charles Perrault. That's a book in French. It was translated. It was considered beneath the dignity of authors to write books for children, so they were published without any name attached. Just like the rise of the novel. If a respected author wrote for children, he wouldn't publish his name. That was beneath his dignity. Now people would say, oh, what a trivial person, what an indecent person to talk like that. So they just wrote under other names. In the 1800s, why were books for children published without any name attached? Writers were ashamed of them. That was the habit with all books. No one knows. The first answer is correct. And then the 1800s, that is, say, the 19th century. In the beginning of the 1800s, children's literature became more creative. As you see, the pace, the rhythm of life itself changed and became faster and faster. And so was children's literature faster and faster. Real literary authors could write for children and not damage their reputations, so they could publish books for children under their own names. Okay, like him. Charles and Mary Lamb, I told you that we are going to have this from the beginning of the lecture. Their brother and sister, Charles Lamb and Mary Lamb, brother and sister, they wrote to give children pleasure. See, that was in the early 1800s. But because they did not write directly from their own imagination to children, this is not the real start of children's literature. I will explain again. Why do we say that the real start of children's literature is in 1865, in which Alice in the Wonderland was written and published? Because it was written specifically for children and for the enjoyment of children. Okay? You are saying now that at the beginning of the 19th century, that is to say before 1865, Charles Lamb and Mary Lamb wrote for children and for the pleasure of children. Why isn't that the beginning of children's literature? Because they did not write directly, specifically, from their own imagination for children. No, they summed up or rewrote the plays of William Shakespeare. The plays of William Shakespeare. They worked together in 1807 to write a children's version of Shakespeare's plays. Tales from Shakespeare, it is called. They wrote tales from Shakespeare, summing them up for children. And that was good, that was nice. But, as I said, it is not the real beginning of children's literature. What did Charles and Mary Lamb write for children in the 19th century? Did they write a novel or a poem or a children's version of Shakespeare's plays? Children's version of Shakespeare's plays. Also, are they husband and wife? A question that could be a nice question too. No, they are not husband and wife. They are brother and sister. Charles and Mary Lamb were, okay, husband and wife, or brother and sister. They were brother and sister, not husband and wife. And then a period of change began in the next 50 years, after 1807. Authors had a profound influence on children's literature. And then Jacob Ludwig and Wilhelm Carl Grimm traveled around Germany, okay, talking to people and collecting folk stories. Their collection was translated into English in 1824. All this led to the development of children's literature. Hans Christian Andersen in 1841 wrote modern fairy tales, so called because Andersen actually created them and copied old ways of telling stories, once again copying, collecting, some of his stories are The Little Mermaid, The Ugly Duckling, and The Emperor's New Clothes. From the 60s to the 90s, socially relevant children's books have appeared. From that time onwards, that was the beginning of, that is the 20th century. The 20th century talks about urban crisis, discrimination, environment, women's liberation. Very big issues are included in children's literature. These books also reveal the trend toward a growing literature for teenagers. In this lecture, we have concentrated on one very important thing. In the history of children's literature, you have various stages, starting from the year 1600. In 1600 onwards, the stress was on moralizing, on preaching, religious preaching, right? But things began to develop, and there were lots of factors leading to the development of children's literature until the year 1865. All those attempts were either oral, not recorded, not written, or full of serious talk to children. Religious talk, political talk, moral discussion, moral preaching. And not a single book was written for children, for the pleasure and for the enjoyment of children. When in 1865 Alice in the Wonderland was written, we begin to notice the start of this flourishing and prospering genre, children's literature, in 1865. Even at the beginning of the 19th century, when some writers began to publish under their own names books for children, they were interested in giving children a moral lesson. And when you give children just a moral lesson, then this is not proper children's literature. What do you understand from the lecture on definitions and the lecture on history? We understand that children's literature has to give children fun and advice, pleasure and instruction. Do you understand? Entertainment and teaching, which is the substance of literature, as Philip Sidney says. What is the job of literature according to Philip Sidney? To teach and to delight. To give a moral lesson and at the same time to give you bahja, delight, pleasure, happiness. Do you understand? And this is what all of children's literature is about. Not pure fun, not pure enjoyment, but a little kind of lesson or advice. And that is why you have many channels for children on the TV. All of them are full of cartoons or movies for children. Children look at them and laugh or just get interested, quite interested in such cartoons or in such films. Why? Because the producers of those films and the people responsible for those channels want to carry a message. They have not built that whole channel in order to get children interested. No, they have a purpose. If you study the cartoons, if you study the programs displayed on those channels, you will be surprised that there are lots and lots of lessons and lots of aims and goals. Allahu A'lam, what they want to give children in those channels. What I mean is, it is a serious business. It is not just you know, a story told for children. No, it is serious. It has lots of repercussions, lots of effects upon children. These books also reveal the trend toward a growing literature for teenagers. Other novelists that write convincingly of growing up in contemporary society include Raskin, Bloom, Weigand. Some critics consider these books as didactic as the children's books of the 17th and early 19th century. Some writers in the present age go back to the 17th and 19th century, forgetting pleasure and enjoyment and concentrating only on didacticism or on education. I hope that the journey has been short, fast, interesting, clear, understandable, rewarding. Thank you very much. I've come to the end of today's lecture, and inshallah next times, perhaps twice or maybe just one time, we will study the characteristics or the features of children's literature. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Until the session ends, well, it is going to end now. Finished.